Dawn breaks over Rattlesnake Junction as a young woman faces the gallows, tears streaming down her porcelain cheeks. Sarah Mitchell, a mail-order bride barely 2 weeks in America, stands accused of a theft she never committed. The mob's self-appointed judge sneers as the noose is fitted around her neck, but fate isn't finished with Sarah yet. Through the morning mist, a wealthy cowboy known for his unshakable honor rides into town, leather saddlebag heavy with truth. In his possession, bank receipts and a signed confession that will shatter the mob's certainty. As he faces down the crowd with steel in his eyes, one question hangs in the desert air. Will justice prevail in a town that's forgotten its soul? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter that changed Sarah Mitchell's life arrived on a rain-soaked Tuesday in County Cork. She found it while sorting through the day's post at O'Malley's General Store, where she'd worked since her father's passing 3 years prior. The cream-colored envelope bore an American postmark, and inside lay a newspaper clipping from the Rattlesnake Junction Gazette. Seeking God-fearing woman of good character and gentle disposition, must be willing to relocate to Wyoming Territory. References required. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the words for the 10th time in the quietude of her modest bedroom that evening. At 26, she'd watched her younger sisters marry one by one, their futures secured while she remained behind, caring for their ailing mother. Now, with mother finally at peace beside father in the church cemetery, Sarah faced a crossroads. The mirror reflected a woman with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, green eyes that held both wisdom and weariness, and a sprinkling of freckles across pale Irish skin. She wasn't a beauty like her sister Mary, but her mother always said she had something better, a kind heart and steady hands. Her response letter took 3 drafts to perfect. Dear Sir, I write in response to your advertisement seeking a bride. I am 26 years of age, of sound mind and good health. I have experience managing a household and working in commerce. My references include Reverend O'Brien of St. Patrick's Parish and Mr. O'Malley, my employer of 8 years. Weeks passed before the reply arrived, bringing with it a train ticket and detailed instructions. The prospective groom, one Thomas Henderson, wrote of his successful mercantile business and plans to expand. His penmanship was neat, his tone respectful. He asked that she arrive by the first frost. Sarah sold what little she owned, save for her mother's rosary and a few cherished books. The whole town turned out to bid her farewell, Mrs. O'Malley, weeping as though she were losing a daughter. "America's so far, child," she fretted, pressing a package of shortbread into Sarah's hands. The crossing was harder than she'd imagined. 13 days of rolling seas, cramped quarters, and the constant sound of children crying in steerage. Sarah spent hours on deck when weather permitted, watching the waves and imagining her new life. Would Thomas Anderson be kind? Would she find friendship in this strange new land? The questions chased each other through her mind like leaves in an autumn wind. New York Harbor emerged from the morning fog like something from a dream. The Statue of Liberty stood tall and proud, her torch a beacon of welcome. Sarah clutched her carpetbag, containing all her worldly possessions, and fought back tears. This was no time for weeping. She was embarking on an adventure. The city itself was overwhelming. Such noise, such crowds. Sarah had thought Dublin busy, but new. York made Ireland's capital seem like a country village. She had 6 hours before her train departed, and she spent them carefully navigating the streets near the station, too afraid of getting lost to venture further. The train journey west revealed an America Sarah had never imagined. Days of watching. The landscape transformed from dense forests to rolling plains to rugged mountains. She shared her car with other women traveling to meet their destinies. 2 mail-order brides bound for Dakota Territory, a young widow going to live with her sister in Colorado, and a school teacher headed for California. They formed a tight bond, sharing food and stories, hopes and fears. Martha, the widow, taught them to play poker with a worn deck of cards. Elizabeth, the schoolteacher, read aloud from her collection of Shakespeare in the evenings. Sarah taught them Irish songs, their voices joining together as the train clattered through the darkness. At each stop, their little group grew smaller. First, Martha departed, then the Dakota-bound brides. Elizabeth was the last to go, leaving Sarah with a warm embrace and a copy of Romeo and Juliet as a parting gift. "Write to me," she insisted, pressing a California address into Sarah's hand. The final leg of the journey was the hardest. The train line ended 2 towns before Rattlesnake Junction, requiring a bumpy stagecoach ride through territory that seemed impossibly wild. Sarah watched golden eagles soar overhead and saw her first real cowboys, dusty and trail-worn, their horses matching their riders' weathered dignity. The coach driver, an elderly man who introduced himself as Old Joe, offered commentary as they traveled. "Rattlesnake Junction's grown some since the Silver Strike," he explained, handling the reins with practiced ease. "Got itself a proper bank. Now, and talk of a school coming soon. Still rough around the edges, mind you, but decent folk mostly." Sarah absorbed every detail, her heart beating faster as they drew closer to her destination. The mountains loomed larger with each passing mile, their snow-capped peaks piercing the clouds. This was to be her home, this vast, beautiful, terrifying land. They arrived as sunset painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. Rattlesnake Junction appeared suddenly around a bend in the road, a collection of wooden buildings straddling the junction of 2 creeks, with the imposing bulk of the new bank standing proud on the main street. Sarah searched the faces of the townsfolk, wondering which might be Thomas Anderson, her future husband. Old Joe helped her down from the coach, tipping his hat with genuine courtesy. "Welcome to Wyoming territory, Miss Mitchell," he said, and there was something like concern in his rheumy eyes. "Mind how you go now. Frontier towns can be mighty particular about newcomers." Sarah squared her shoulders and took her first steps into her new life, unaware that in less than 2 weeks she would stand accused of a terrible crime, with only a stranger's honor standing between her and the gallows. The first person Sarah met in Rattlesnake Junction was Mabel Turner, proprietress of the town's only boarding house. The older woman took one look at Sarah's travel-worn appearance and clucked her tongue sympathetically. "Thomas Anderson, you say? Haven't seen him in near 3 days, but don't you fret, we'll get you settled proper." The boarding house parlor smelled of pine soap and fresh-baked bread. Mabel poured tea from a chipped blue pot, while Sarah sank gratefully into an overstuffed chair. Through the window, she watched townsfolk hurrying about their evening business, as shadows lengthened across the dusty street. "Anderson's been acting peculiar lately," Mabel confided, passing Sarah a plate of biscuits. "Ever since Judge Kane started showing special interest in his business dealings." She lowered her voice. "The judge runs this town, more or less. What he says goes, whether it's written in law or not." Sarah would soon learn just how true those words were. Judge Marcus Kane was a man who wore authority like a second skin, tall, broad-shouldered, with steel-grey hair and eyes that seemed to strip away pretense. He appeared at the boarding house the very next morning, ostensibly to welcome the town's newest resident. "Miss Mitchell," he said, removing his black hat with practiced courtesy. "Word travels fast in small towns. I trust you'll find Rattlesnake Junction to your liking." His smile never reached his eyes. "Though I'm concerned about your intended's absence." Sarah felt a chill despite the warm morning sun. "Mr. Anderson sent instructions to meet him. Here, I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for the delay." "Indeed." Kane's gaze lingered uncomfortably. "Meanwhile, you'll need employment. The general store is short-handed since Mrs. Peterson's unfortunate passing. I'll speak with Mr. Peterson about taking you on." It wasn't really a suggestion. By that afternoon, Sarah found herself behind the counter of Peterson's general store, learning the inventory from a grief-stricken widower who barely seemed to register her presence. The store was a maze of barrels, shelves, and hanging goods, everything from mining supplies to ladies' notions. The work itself was familiar enough, not so different from O'Malley's back home, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the way customers watched her, whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. Anderson's mail-order bride, they'd say, or Kane's latest project. Days passed with no word from Thomas Anderson. Sarah wrote to Elizabeth in California, describing her situation in carefully chosen words. She attended Sunday services at the small Methodist church, where Reverend Whitaker's sermon on Abraham's test of faith felt uncomfortably pointed. It was Mrs. Peterson's old ledger that first raised her suspicions. Bound while cleaning behind the counter, its pages revealed careful notes about Judge Kane's business practices, inflated prices, forced purchases, loans with impossible terms. Sarah recognized the pattern from stories her father had told about. Landlords back in Ireland. "Best put that away, Miss Mitchell," Mr. Peterson warned when he caught her reading it. His hands shook as he took the ledger. Some things in this town are better left uninvestigated, but Sarah couldn't forget what she'd seen, especially after young Tommy Jenkins came in crying about his family's farm being seized over a debt they'd nearly paid off. She began keeping her own careful records, noting down stories customers shared in unguarded moments. The bank became a daily part of her routine, depositing the store's earnings each evening. Mr. Whitmore, the bank manager, was a nervous man who seemed to flinch at sudden movements. His assistant, James Fuller, was cut from different cloth. Confident, charming, and always quick with a smile for Sarah. "A woman who understands figures," Fuller remarked one day, watching her count out the deposit. "Rare enough to find that, even in Boston, let alone out here." He leaned closer than strictly necessary. "Judge Kane mentioned you're still waiting on your intended. Shame if something's happened to him." Sarah withdrew slightly, disliking his tone. "Mr. Anderson will arrive when he's able. Meanwhile, I'm grateful for honest work." But Thomas Anderson would never arrive. A week later, Sarah learned why from a newspaper that blew in with a stagecoach from Cheyenne. The headline read, "Merchant found dead in mining accident." The article described how Thomas Anderson had perished in a cave-in while inspecting a silver mine he'd recently acquired, a mine sold to him by none other than Judge Marcus Kane. That evening, as Sarah walked back to the boarding house, she felt eyes following her progress down the twilit street. The shadows seemed longer, darker, and Judge Kane's earlier words echoed in her memory. Word travels fast in small towns. She clutched her mother's rosary and whispered a prayer, unaware that in just a few days' time she would need far more than prayers to survive what was coming. The morning the gold disappeared dawned cold and clear, with frost etching delicate patterns on the general store's windows. Sarah arrived early, as was her habit, to organize the new shipment of dry goods that had come in on yesterday's stage. The street outside was quiet, save for the distant crow of a rooster and the soft crunch of boots on frozen ground as the town began to stir. She was arranging sacks of flour when the first shouts erupted from the direction of the bank. Within minutes, the sound of running feet and raised voices filled the street. Mr. Peterson appeared in the doorway, his face ashen. "Miss Mitchell, you'd better come quick. There's trouble at the bank." The scene that greeted them was chaos. The bank's heavy doors stood wide open, and a crowd had gathered, their breath forming clouds in the cold morning air. James Fuller stood on the steps, his usual composure shattered. 10,000 in gold bars," he was saying, his voice carrying across the murmuring crowd, "stolen sometime during the night." Judge Kane arrived moments later, his long coat billowing as he strode through the parting crowd. Bank manager Whitmore wrung his hands as he explained how he'd opened the vault that morning to find the gold missing, gold that had been destined for the railroad payroll. "A thorough search," Kane commanded, his voice cutting through the babble of speculation. "Every building, every home. Nobody leaves town until we find what's missing." Sarah watched as men were organized into search parties, led by Fuller and the town's makeshift deputies. She returned to the store, her mind racing. The theft would devastate the town. Without the railroad payroll, construction would halt, and with it the promise of prosperity that had drawn so many settlers. The search proceeded methodically through the morning. Sarah could hear them moving, from building to building, the sound drawing steadily closer. When they finally reached the general store, Fuller led the group himself. "Nothing personal, Miss Mitchell," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We have to check everywhere." They searched thoroughly, moving boxes and barrels, checking behind shelves. Sarah stood with Mr. Peterson, watching as they dismantled the careful order she'd created over the past weeks. Then came a shout from the storeroom. "Judge Kane, you'd better see this!" Sarah's heart nearly stopped as one of the deputies emerged holding a canvas bag, its contents clinking heavily. From its mouth gleamed the unmistakable glint of gold. "Hidden behind the flour barrels," the deputy announced. "Wrapped in this." He held up a shawl. Sarah's shawl, the one she'd worn on her journey from Ireland. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as every eye turned toward her. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I never—" "Sarah Mitchell." Judge Kane's voice carried the weight of judgment. "You are under arrest for the theft of bank property." "No!" Sarah stepped forward, her mind reeling. "I'm innocent. I was nowhere near the bank last night. I was at the boarding house. Mrs. Turner can verify." "Take her to the jail," Kane ordered, cutting off her protests. "We'll hold trial at sunset." Rough hands seized her arms. As they dragged her toward the door, she caught a glimpse of Fuller's face. Was that a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes? "Mr. Peterson," she called out desperately. "You know I wouldn't—" But the old man turned away, unable or unwilling to meet her gaze. The jail was a small building of rough-hewn logs, containing 2 cells and a deputy's desk. They locked her in the smaller cell, its iron bars casting stripped shadows across the dirt floor. Through the window, she could see the gallows that stood permanent witness in the town square, a reminder of frontier justice. The hours crawled by like wounded things. Sarah huddled on the narrow cot, clutching her mother's rosary and trying to make sense of what had happened. The gold in the storeroom, her shawl. Someone had planted them, but who and why? She thought of Mrs. Peterson's ledger, of the patterns she'd noticed in Kane's dealings, the missing Thomas Anderson and his mysterious death. The pieces were there, but she couldn't quite fit them together. Deputy Wilson, a young man with kind eyes, brought her water and a plate of bread. "Trial's set for 6 o'clock, he said quietly. "Judge Kane's already called in the jury." He hesitated. "Miss Mitchell, there's talk of making an example. With the railroad watching," Sarah understood. The town needed to show the railroad company that law and order prevailed, that their investment would be protected. She was to be their proof. As the sun began its descent, she heard the crowd gathering in the street. The sound of hammering came from the square. They were checking the gallows, ensuring everything was in order. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cold iron bars and prayed. The cell door opened at exactly 6. Deputy Wilson and Fuller escorted her to the makeshift courtroom in the saloon. The usual tables had been cleared away, replaced by rows of chairs filled with grim-faced townspeople. Judge Kane sat behind a table on a raised platform, his black coat stark against the rough wooden walls. "Sarah Mitchell," he intoned as she was brought before him, "you stand accused of the theft of bank property valued at $10,000 in gold. How do you plead?" "Not guilty." Sarah's voice shook but held firm. "I'm innocent of these charges." The trial, such as it was, proceeded with terrible swiftness. Fuller testified about finding the gold wrapped in her shawl. Others spoke of seeing her at the bank, of her access to the storeroom, of her mysterious arrival in town and connection to the deceased Thomas Anderson. When Sarah tried to speak in her own defense, to point out the impossibility of her moving such heavy gold alone, of the coincidence of her shawl being used, Kane silenced her. "The evidence speaks for itself." As the last light faded from the Windows, Kane stood. The jury will now deliberate. They were gone less than 5 minutes. Guilty, the foreman announced, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. Kane's voice fell like an axe. The sentence is death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn tomorrow. He paused, his gaze boring into Sarah. Unless anyone can provide evidence to the contrary, justice will be served when the sun rises. As they led her back to her cell, Sarah caught fragments of conversation from the dispersing crowd. Frontier justice. Send a message. Poor thing. But what can you expect from a foreigner? In the gathering darkness, Sarah sank onto her cot. Tomorrow at dawn, she would die for a crime she didn't commit, in a town that had already decided her guilt. She touched the cold iron bars and whispered a prayer into the night, not knowing that at that very moment a rider was approaching. Rattlesnake Junction at a gallop, saddlebags heavy with the truth that would save her life. Night settled over Rattlesnake Junction like a burial shroud. From her cell, Sarah could hear the sounds of the town preparing for tomorrow's grim spectacle. The creak of wagon wheels bringing extra chairs for the crowd, the murmur of voices, discussing the best spots to view the hanging, the steady rhythm of hammers testing the gallows' strength. Her mother's rosary beads clicked softly through her fingers as she whispered prayers in the darkness. The smooth wooden beads, worn from years of devotion, offered little comfort now. What would her family think when they received news of her? Wait, would anyone back in Ireland believe she'd died a thief's death? Deputy Wilson's boots scraped against the wooden floor as he made his rounds. He paused at her cell, lamplight casting his shadow through the bars. "Can I bring you anything, Miss Mitchell? Some tea, maybe?" Sarah looked up from her prayers. "Paper and pen, if you would. I'd like to write some letters." He hesitated, then nodded. "Judge Kane said no messages to anyone in town, but I reckon letters to Ireland won't matter much now." When he returned with the writing materials, Sarah noticed his hands trembling slightly as he passed them through the bars. "I've got daughters myself," he said quietly. "Can't help thinking—" "Thank you," Sarah interrupted gently, sparing him the need to finish the thought. Some kindnesses were harder to bear than cruelty. She settled at the small table bolted to the cell wall, the lamp's weak light barely sufficient for writing. The first letter was to her sisters, Mary, Catherine, and young Ellen. She told them she loved them, that she was innocent of any wrongdoing, that they shouldn't grieve too long. She wrote of the beauty she'd found in America, of the kindness, of strangers on her journey west, of her hopes for a new life that would now go unfulfilled. The second letter was harder to write. Addressed to Elizabeth, her friend from the train, it contained the truth about Judge Kane's corruption and her suspicions about Thomas Anderson's death. "If you're reading this," she wrote, "then I'm already gone. But perhaps the truth can still come to light, even if too late for me." A sound from the street drew her attention. Bootfalls on wooden planks, the clink of spurs. A stranger's voice carried through her window, asking directions to the sheriff's office. Sarah paid it little mind. Travellers often passed through town, and tomorrow's hanging would draw plenty of gawkers. Deputy Wilson appeared again, this time with a bowl of soup and a thick slice of bread. "Mrs. Turner sent this from the boarding house. Said you should keep your strength up." Sarah accepted the food, but couldn't bring herself to eat. Instead, she found herself remembering her last night in Ireland, how she'd stood at her bedroom window watching moonlight silver the fields she'd known since childhood. How full of hope she'd been then, dreaming of her new life in America. "Did I ever tell you about my mother, Deputy?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself. "She died last winter. Consumption. I nursed her through it, watched her fade day by day. She made me promise to find happiness, to build a life of my own." A bitter laugh escaped her. "I wonder what she'd think of this." Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "Miss Mitchell, It's all right," she said. "You're just doing your duty, like everyone else in this town." The night deepened. Sarah could hear celebration from the saloon. Someone had ordered drinks, a round in honor of justice being served. She thought of James Fuller's satisfied smirk, of Judge Kane's cold eyes, of Mr. Peterson turning away when she needed him most. She dozed fitfully on the narrow cot, waking often to the sound of her own heart pounding. Each time, her hand would fly to her throat, imagining the rope that would soon encircle it. In those dark moments between sleep and waking, she thought she heard her mother's voice. "Keep faith, my girl. The night is darkest before dawn." Shortly before midnight, the deputy brought her a cup of coffee. "Thought you might want to stay awake," he explained awkwardly. "Some folks prefer it that way at the end." Sarah took the cup, warming her hands against its rough ceramic. "Deputy Wilson," she said carefully, "you've been kind to me. Will you do one last kindness? Will you tell me the truth about Thomas Anderson?" He glanced toward the office, ensuring they were alone. "Miss Mitchell, there are things in this town, patterns a smart woman might notice, things about Judge Kane's business dealings, about how certain people who ask questions tend to meet with accidents, like Thomas Anderson investigating a silver mine." Wilson nodded almost imperceptibly. A man like that, successful merchant from back east, should have known better than to look too closely at the judge's papers. Cave-ins can happen to anyone after all. Sarah absorbed this confirmation of her suspicions, fitting it into the pattern she'd begun to see. The ledger, the loans, the seized properties, and now the missing gold. But why frame her, unless the bank records? She whispered. "I was the only one who saw the daily deposits, who might have noticed." A sudden commotion from the street interrupted her revelation. Raised voices, the sound of running feet. Wilson hurried to the window, then rushed to grab his gun from the desk. "What is it?" Sarah asked, heart pounding. "Ryder just came in," Wilson said, buckling on his gun belt. "Says he has evidence about the gold theft. Judge Kane's called an emergency meeting at the saloon." He paused at the door. "Miss Mitchell, I hope you know I never wanted any part of this." Then he was gone, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and prayers in the darkened jail. Outside, the sounds of activity grew as townspeople were roused from their beds. A crowd was gathering, drawn by the late-night drama. Sarah returned to her mother's rosary, fingers moving over the familiar beads. But now she prayed not for salvation, but for justice, not just for herself, but for Thomas Anderson, for Tommy Jenkins' family, for all those who had suffered under Kane's corruption. Dawn was still hours away. Whether it would bring death or deliverance remained to be seen. Lucas Sterling had seen his share of frontier justice during his 15 years as a Texas Ranger, but something about this case struck him wrong from the start. He'd been tracking a series of bank robberies across 3 territories when word reached him about Rattlesnake Junction's gold theft and the swift conviction of a mail-order bride. The pieces didn't fit. 10,000 in gold bars was too heavy for a woman to move alone and too bulky to hide in a general store without help. More importantly, why would someone clever enough to orchestrate such a theft leave evidence wrapped in their own shawl? His instincts, honed by years of separating truth from lies, had prompted him to dig deeper. What he found in Cheyenne's territorial records painted a disturbing picture. A pattern of convenient accidents, foreclosed properties, and missing money, all circling around Judge Marcus Kane like buzzards over dying cattle. Sterling's bay horse, a sturdy animal named Chief, carried him through the moonlit Wyoming night at a steady lope. The saddlebags bounced with each stride, heavy with documents that would shatter Kane's carefully constructed facade. Bank records, showing systematic theft. Witness statements about Thomas Anderson's final days, and a signed confession from a mine worker paid to trigger the cave-in. But the most damning evidence had come from James Fuller's own hand. The bank assistant had been careless in Cheyenne, celebrating his newfound wealth in saloons where lonely women were eager to hear tales of frontier banking. One of these women, recognizing Sterling's Texas Ranger badge, had shared a remarkable story about gold bars and a judge's perfect plan. It hadn't taken much pressure for Fuller to crack once Sterling tracked him down. The man had a yellow streak, wider than the Rio Grande, and the threat of a hanging charge loosened his tongue. Quickly enough, the signed confession in Sterling's saddlebag told the whole sordid tale. How Kane had orchestrated the theft, how Fuller had planted the gold in the shawl, how they'd chosen Sarah Mitchell as their scapegoat because she was a foreigner with no connections and too many questions about the bank's bookkeeping. The moon was setting by the time Rattlesnake Junction appeared on the horizon. Sterling had pushed hard to arrive before dawn, knowing that frontier justice waited for no man or woman. The town's silhouette was broken by the stark outline of a gallows, its shadow stretching across the empty street like an accusation. He dismounted outside the sheriff's office, boots raising small clouds of dust. The deputy on duty looked up sharply at his entrance, hand moving toward his gun until Sterling's badge caught the lamplight. "Lucas Sterling, Texas Rangers," he announced, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "I need to speak with Judge Kane immediately. It concerns the gold theft and Sarah Mitchell's conviction." The deputy, Wilson, according to his nameplate, hesitated only briefly before hurrying to rouse the town's leadership. Within minutes, the saloon was filling with bleary-eyed men in various states of dress, all drawn by the late-night commotion. Sterling studied them as they entered, noting their reactions. Most showed simple curiosity, but a few, including a well-dressed man he recognized as James Fuller from the Cheyenne photographs, displayed the nervous energy of guilty men. Judge Kane arrived last, cutting an impressive figure in his black coat despite the late hour. His steel-grey eyes assessed Sterling with the cold calculation of a snake sizing up potential prey. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Sterling," Kane said, emphasizing the "Mr." as though questioning the Rangers' authority. "We have a legal execution scheduled for dawn. The condemned has been properly tried and convicted." Sterling placed his saddlebags on the bar with deliberate care. "Then you'll want to hear what I have to say about James Fuller's recent activities in Cheyenne." He turned to face the bank assistant, who had gone pale. "Would you like to tell them, Mr. Fuller, or shall I?" The saloon fell silent as Sterling laid out the evidence document by document. Bank records showing systematic theft, witness statements about Thomas Anderson's murder, Fuller's signed confession detailing Kane's involvement in every crime. "A touching story," Kane sneered, but there was sweat on his brow despite the cool night air. "But the word of a condemned thief against respected businessmen—" "And this," Sterling interrupted, producing a final document. "A receipt for the actual gold, safely deposited in the Cheyenne Territorial Bank under your private account, Judge. Seems you were planning quite a comfortable retirement." The sound of hammers being cocked broke the tension. Fuller had drawn a derringer, its small barrel pointing at Sterling's chest. "Nobody needs to see these papers," he said, voice shaking. "Accidents happen, even to Texas Rangers." Sterling didn't move. "Sorry, son, but those documents were registered with the Territorial Marshal's office this afternoon. Killing me won't change what's coming." For a moment, the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. Then Deputy Wilson's voice rang out, "Drop it, Fuller. It's over." The derringer clattered to the floor. Within moments, both Fuller and Kane were in custody, their protests drowned out by the angry mutters of townspeople who'd been deceived. For too long, Sterling gathered his evidence, tucking it safely away. "Now," he said quietly, "I believe there's an innocent woman waiting to hear she's been cleared of all charges." He headed for the jail, boots ringing on the wooden sidewalk. Dawn was still hours away, but for Sarah Mitchell a new day was already beginning. Sarah had dozed off on her cot when the jangle of keys startled her awake. The cell door opened with a metallic groan, and there stood Deputy Wilson, lantern held high, his face a mixture of shame and relief. Behind him towered a stranger, tall, broad-shouldered, with the weathered features of a man who'd spent years under desert suns. "Miss Mitchell," the stranger said, removing his hat to reveal graying temples that belied his otherwise youthful Appearance. I'm Lucas Sterling, Texas Rangers. You're free to go. The real thieves are in custody. Sarah's legs trembled as she stood, hardly daring to believe. Judge Kane and James Fuller, Sterling confirmed. We have their confessions, along with proof of their other crimes, including what really happened to Thomas Anderson. The truth spilled out like water from a broken dam as they walked to the boarding house. How Kane had been systematically stealing from the bank for years, using Fuller to cook the books. How Thomas Anderson had discovered their scheme while investigating the silver mine purchase. How they'd arranged his accident when he wouldn't be bought off. They chose you as their scapegoat because you were starting to notice patterns in the bank deposits, Sterling explained. Kane couldn't risk another Thomas Anderson asking uncomfortable questions. Mrs. Turner was waiting at the boarding house door, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. She enveloped Sarah in a fierce embrace that smelled of fresh bread and coffee. Oh, child, we nearly lost you to their wickedness. Inside, the parlor had filled with townspeople, Mr. Peterson from the store, Reverend Whitaker, and others who'd been at the trial. Their faces showed varying degrees of guilt and relief. Sterling watched them with the measured gaze of a man accustomed to reading human nature. The territorial marshal will arrive tomorrow to formally charge Kane and Fuller, he announced to the room. Anyone with information about other crimes or suspicious accidents should come forward. It's time for honest justice in Rattlesnake Junction. Mr. Peterson stepped forward, clutching his wife's ledger. Sarah, I'm sorry I didn't speak up. After what happened to Martha and then Thomas Anderson, I was afraid. We all were, Reverend Whitaker added softly. Fear makes cowards of even good men. Sarah looked at their faces. Neighbors who'd condemned her hours ago, now seeking absolution. The night's terrors still echoed in her mind, but something else stirred beneath her fear. Understanding. They'd all been victims of Kane's corruption, each in their own way. Perhaps, she said carefully, we can learn from this. Build something better. Sterling's quiet voice carried approval. Frontier justice only works when good people stand together against corruption. Miss Mitchell shows more grace than many would in her position. The sun was rising by the time the impromptu gathering dispersed. Sarah stood at the boarding house window, watching golden light spill across the town square. The gallows that had waited for her now stood empty, a reminder of how close she'd come to death. They'll tear it down, Sterling said, having lingered. Behind the departing townspeople, the territorial marshal will establish proper court procedures. No more midnight trials or vigilante justice. Sarah turned to study him properly for the first time. His face showed the lines of hard years and harder decisions, but his eyes held kindness alongside their steel. Here was a man who understood both justice and mercy, who'd seen enough of human nature to be cynical, yet chose to believe in redemption. How did you know to investigate? She asked. Why did you believe I might be innocent when everyone else assumed guilt? Sterling's mouth quirked in a half-smile. 15 years of ranger work teaches you to look deeper than surface evidence. A woman clever enough to manage bank deposits and notice accounting irregularities wouldn't be foolish enough to hide stolen gold in her own workplace, wrapped in her own shawl. He paused, watching dawn paint the mountains pink and gold. Besides, I knew Thomas Anderson slightly, met him in Cheyenne while he was investigating the silver mine purchase. He mentioned writing to a mail-order bride, spoke of her intelligence and character based on her letters. When I heard about the theft and your arrest, well, pieces didn't fit. Sarah's heart tightened at the mention of Thomas. He seemed an honorable man from his letters. I wish he was, Sterling confirmed gently. His death wasn't your fault. Kane would have found another excuse to silence him eventually. Mrs. Turner's voice called from the kitchen, announcing breakfast. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the house, reminding Sarah she hadn't eaten since before the trial. Life's simple rhythms continued, even after the darkest nights. Will you join us, Mr. Sterling? She asked impulsively. After what? You've done. He shook his head, though his eyes showed regret. Need to help Deputy Wilson secure the prisoners and prepare for the marshal's arrival. But perhaps, he hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain, perhaps we could speak more. Later, about the town's future, it will need strong people to help rebuild trust. Sarah found herself nodding. I'd like that. As Sterling departed, Sarah watched him cross the street toward the jail. The town was awakening around her, shopkeepers opening their doors, women sweeping porches, children darting between buildings. Yesterday's mob had become simply neighbors again, each carrying their own burden of guilt and relief. She touched the wooden rosary beads in her pocket, offering a prayer of thanks for deliverance. The night's terror had passed, but its lessons remained, about justice and mercy, fear and courage, and the importance of looking deeper than surface truths. Outside her window, the morning stage arrived right on schedule. Life in Rattlesnake Junction would go on, changed but unbroken. And Sarah Mitchell, who'd come seeking a new life as a mail-order bride, found herself contemplating a different kind of future, one she'd never imagined, but which suddenly seemed full of possibility. The territorial marshal arrived with the midday stage, bringing with him the weight of official justice. Marshal Henry Brooks was a compact man, with iron-grey hair and a methodical manner that suggested nothing escaped his notice. He set up court in the saloon, the same room where Sarah had been condemned just a day earlier. Word had spread quickly through the surrounding countryside, drawing farmers, ranchers, and miners whose lives had been touched by Kane's corruption. They filled every available space, their faces grim with purpose. Sarah sat near the front, Sterling's solid presence beside her lending strength as she prepared to testify. Kane and Fuller were brought in wearing shackles, their fine clothes wrinkled from a night in the cells. Kane's imperious bearing had crumbled, leaving him looking older and smaller. Fuller couldn't stop shaking, his eyes darting between faces. In the crowd, as though searching for sympathy he wouldn't find. Court of the Wyoming Territory is now in session, Marshal Brooks announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. We're here to address charges of theft, corruption, and murder against Marcus Kane and James Fuller. The evidence unfolded methodically. Sterling presented the documents from his saddlebags, bank records, witness statements, Fuller's confession. Sarah testified about the patterns she'd noticed in the deposits, her voice steady as she described her near execution. Others came forward with their own stories, seized properties, impossible loans, mysterious accidents that had befallen those who asked too many questions. Tommy Jenkins' father spoke about his farm, his weathered hands clenched as he described how Kane's manipulated loans had nearly cost him his family's legacy. The widow of a miner who died alongside Thomas Anderson revealed how Kane had cheated her of her husband's pension. Through it all, Marshal Brooks took careful notes, his expression revealing nothing. But when Mr. Peterson presented his late wife's ledger documenting years of Kane's schemes, the marshal's pen paused. Mrs. Peterson was a brave woman, he said quietly. She kept recording the truth, even knowing the danger. Kane's composure finally broke. You can't trust these people, he shouted, rising from his chair. They're nothing but failed farmers and ignorant immigrants. I brought civilization to this town. I brought progress. Sit down, Kane, Marshal Brooks commanded. Progress built on corruption isn't progress at all. The testimony continued through the afternoon. Sarah found herself studying the townspeople's faces as they listened. She saw shame there, and anger, but also determination, a community confronting its own complicity and choosing to do better. Sterling was the final witness, his ranger's badge catching the light as he stood. He spoke of following the trail, of Kane's crimes across 3 territories, of connecting the dots that led to Thomas Anderson's murder, of the broader pattern of corruption that had poisoned not just Rattlesnake Junction, but other frontier towns as well. The frontier needs law, he concluded, his quiet voice carrying moral authority, but it needs justice more. What happened here, what nearly happened to Miss Mitchell, shows the difference between the two. As the sun began to set, Marshal. Brooks called for order. Having heard the evidence, I'm prepared to render judgment. The room fell silent. Marcus Kane and James Fuller, you are hereby remanded to territorial custody to face charges of theft, corruption, and murder. You'll be transported to Cheyenne for formal trial. He paused, surveying the room. As for the broader corruption, in Rattlesnake Junction, all properties seized under Kane's authority will be reviewed. The Territorial Bank will audit accounts and make restitution where fraud is found. This town needs healing, and that starts with making things right. Kane and Fuller were led away to await the prison wagon from Cheyenne. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself approached by Tommy Jenkins' father. The old farmer twisted his hat in his hands. Miss Mitchell, what was done to you? We've all got shame to carry for that. Sarah touched his arm gently. We were all victims of Kane's schemes, Mr. Jenkins. Now we have a chance to rebuild something better. Sterling appeared at her elbow. Marshal Brooks would like to speak with you, Miss Mitchell, about the bank's future management. She followed him to where the marshal sat reviewing documents. Brooks looked up as they approached. Miss Mitchell, Mr. Sterling speaks highly of your financial acumen. The bank will need an interim manager while we sort out this mess. Someone the town trusts who understands both numbers and people. Sarah blinked in surprise. Me, but you're exactly what this town needs, Sterling interjected. Someone who's seen both justice and injustice, who understands the importance of doing things right. Marshal Brooks nodded. The territory will provide oversight, of course, but having someone local, someone who's proven their integrity, it would help restore faith in the institution. Sarah looked around the saloon, now nearly empty. Through the window she could see the gallows being dismantled, townspeople working together to remove that symbol of frontier justice gone wrong. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of possibility. I'll need help, she said finally. There's so much to untangle. You'll have it, Sterling assured her. His hand brushed hers briefly, the touch conveying support and something more. I've been reassigned to this district. The territory needs someone watching for corruption taking root in other towns. Marshal Brooks gathered his papers, a slight smile touching his lips. I'll leave you two to discuss the details. Miss Mitchell, we'll speak more tomorrow about the bank's reorganization. As the marshal departed, Sarah and Sterling stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the mountains gold. Yesterday, she'd faced death on those gallows. Today, she faced a future she'd never imagined, not as a mail-order bride, but as a woman of substance and responsibility. Quite a change from Ireland, Sterling observed softly. Sarah smiled, touching her mother's rosary in her pocket. Mother always said God works in mysterious ways. I don't think this is quite what she meant, though. His quiet laughter joined. Hers, a sound of healing and hope in the gathering dusk. Dawn painted the bank's freshly scrubbed windows with golden light as Sarah unlocked the heavy front doors. The brass nameplate still bore James Fuller's name, though someone had scraped it with a knife, leaving jagged scratches across the surface. A fitting metaphor, she thought, for the wounds this town was working to heal. Inside, the morning sun revealed the magnitude of her task. Papers lay scattered across desks where Marshal Brooks' men had searched for evidence. The vault stood open, its empty shelves a reminder of Kane's final theft. But beneath the chaos lay opportunity, a chance to rebuild something honest and true. Mrs. Turner had insisted Sarah move into the bank manager's quarters upstairs. Can't have our new banker living in a boarding house, she'd declared, helping Sarah carry her meager belongings across the street. The rooms were sparse but dignified, with large windows overlooking the town square where the gallows had stood just days ago. Sterling appeared at the bank's door just as Sarah finished organizing the first stack of accounts. He carried a leather satchel and wore a fresh shirt, though his boots still bore the dust of his morning rounds. Thought you might want help. Sorting through all this, he said, setting down 2 cups of coffee from the hotel restaurant. I've seen enough banking crimes to know what to look for. They worked together through the morning, shoulders occasionally brushing as they pieced together the extent of Kane's schemes. Sterling's experience helped identify patterns of fraud, while Sarah's memory of recent transactions guided them through the maze of numbers. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to an entry. "The Jenkins loan. Kane was charging them triple the interest he recorded in the official ledger. No wonder they couldn't keep up with payments." Sterling leaned close, his presence warm and steady. "We'll make it right," he promised. "Every false debt, every stolen dollar." The bell above the door chimed as Mr. Peterson entered, carrying his wife's ledger. "Thought this might help," he said, placing it gently on the desk. "Martha, she'd want it used to fix what's broken." More townspeople arrived throughout the day, bringing records of transactions, letters, receipts. Each piece helped complete the puzzle of Kane's corruption. But they brought something else too: hesitant smiles, quiet words of apology, offers of help. Reverend Whitaker appeared with a basket of fresh bread and preserves from his wife. "The church board met this morning," he announced. "We've established a fund to help those hardest hit by Kane's schemes. Not charity, mind you, just neighbors helping neighbors." Sarah watched the town marshal nail a notice to the post office door across the street. "All property seizures under review." Beside it, another paper announced the arrival of a circuit, judged next month to establish proper court procedures. "Change comes slowly to frontier towns," Sterling observed, following her gaze. "But it does come." The afternoon sun was lowering when Sarah finally sat back, rubbing her tired eyes. They'd made good progress, but weeks of work lay ahead. Sterling gathered his papers, reluctant to leave, yet knowing he had duties to attend to. "I'll be riding out to the Jenkins farm tomorrow," he said. "Need to take statements about Kane's dealings with other ranchers in the valley, but I'll stop by after." Sarah smiled, understanding the unspoken question in his tone. "I'd like that." That evening, alone in her new quarters, Sarah wrote 2 letters. The first to her sisters in Ireland, telling them of her strange journey from mail-order bride to banker, of justice served and hope renewed. The second to Elizabeth in California, sharing news of Kane's arrest and her unexpected future in Rattlesnake Junction. As she sealed the envelopes, a knock at the door revealed Mrs. Turner with a housewarming gift, a small painting of wildflowers in a simple frame. "To brighten your new home," she said. "And Sarah, we're glad you stayed, despite everything." Sarah hung the painting where morning light would catch it. Through her window she could see lights twinkling across town, the saloon, the general store, scattered homes. No longer hostile territory, but a community finding its way back to trust. Her mother's rosary lay on the bedside table, its familiar beads catching lamplight. Sarah touched them gently, remembering her mother's words about God's mysterious ways. She hadn't found the future she'd expected in Rattlesnake Junction, but perhaps she'd found the one she was meant for. Sterling's invitation to Sunday dinner at his ranch came after a particularly exhausting week of untangling Kane's financial web. "You need a break from ledgers," he'd said simply. "Come see what honest work looks like." The ranch spread across 1,000 acres of Wyoming territory, nestled against the foothills where prairie met mountains. Sarah sat beside Sterling in his buggy, watching the town fall away behind them as they followed a well-worn trail through spring-green grassland. "My father started with just 50 acres, Sterling explained, handling the reins with casual expertise. "Built it up over 30 years. I was ranging in Texas when he passed, but couldn't bear to sell it. Hired good people to run things while I finished my service." The main house appeared around a bend, a sturdy 2-story structure of weathered wood and native stone. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the smell of cooking reached them even before they stopped in the front yard. On the wide porch, an elderly woman wiped her hands on her apron and called out a greeting. "Mrs. Hawkins," Sterling explained. "Been housekeeper here since I was a boy. Makes the best biscuits this side of the Mississippi." The interior was a surprise. Not the sparse bachelor quarters Sarah had expected, but a well-maintained home, with comfortable furniture, colorful quilts, and shelves of books. Mathematics texts shared space with poetry volumes and dog-eared novels. Mother loved reading, Sterling said, catching her interest in the library. Taught at the local school before she married father. Always said education was as important as cattle. Mrs. Hawkins had prepared a feast, roast chicken, fresh vegetables from the kitchen garden, and those famous biscuits. Over dinner, Sterling spoke of his plans for the ranch, expanding the herd, experimenting with new breeding stock, teaching local boys proper cattle management. The territory's changing, he observed. Can't just be about survival anymore. Need to build something lasting. After the meal, they walked the property. Sarah met the ranch hands, watched the cattle grazing on distant hillsides, learned about the rhythms of ranch life. Everything ran with the precision she recognized from her work at the bank. Careful records, planned improvements, invested capital yielding honest returns. At the stable, Sterling introduced her to his horses. "This is Chief," he said, patting the bay stallion's neck. "Carried me through some rough country, and here's Lady, gentlest mare I've ever known. Perfect for someone learning to ride Western style." Sarah reached out to stroke Lady's velvet nose. "Are you offering to teach me?" "If you're interested." His smile held warmth and something more. "Bank can spare you on Sundays, I reckon." They stopped at the top of a small rise overlooking the ranch. The setting sun painted the buildings gold, while prairie flowers dotted the grass at their feet. In the distance, cattle moved like dark dots against the landscape, and mountains rose purple against the horizon. "I never thought I'd find this in America," Sarah said softly. "When I agreed to be a mail-order bride, I imagined a small farm, perhaps, or a town dwelling. But this, life has a way of surprising us," Sterling replied. "A Texas Ranger wasn't exactly what you were expecting when you wrote to Thomas Anderson." Sarah turned to study his face in the fading light. "No, it wasn't, but perhaps it's what I was meant to find." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibility. Then Mrs. Hawkins rang the dinner bell, signaling time for dessert, and they made their way back to the house. As they drove back to town in the gathering dusk, Sarah found herself seeing her new life with fresh clarity. The bank wasn't just a job. It was a chance to build something meaningful, just as Sterling had done with his ranch. Both of them understood the value of patient growth, of nurturing something honest and true. "Same time next Sunday?" Sterling asked as he helped her down from the buggy in front of the bank. Sarah smiled, still feeling the peace of the ranch in her heart. "I'd like that very much." Above them, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, each one a point of light, marking the end of one day and the promise of another. Sarah touched her mother's rosary in her pocket and said a quiet prayer of thanks, not for salvation this time, but for the gift of new beginnings. Sunday mornings now found Sarah at Sterling Ranch, where dew-kissed grass sparkled beneath Wyoming's endless sky. She'd swap her banker's attire for a sturdy riding skirt, ready for her weekly lessons with Lady, the gentle mare Sterling had chosen for her. "Sit deep in the saddle," Sterling would remind her, his hand steady on Lady's bridle. "Let your body move with her rhythm." His teaching style matched his character, patient, thorough, and quietly encouraging. Under his guidance, Sarah progressed, from nervous clinching to confident posting, from tentative walks to adventurous trots. Mrs. Hawkins watched their lessons from the porch, her knowing smile hidden behind a cup of morning coffee. "Never seen the boss spend so much time teaching anyone to ride," she confided one afternoon, while Sarah helped shell peas. "Course, never seen him look at anyone quite the way he looks at you, either." The ranch hands took to calling her Miss Sarah, tipping their hats when she passed. They'd gather at day's end to share stories of Texas cattle drives and frontier adventures, their rough voices softening when they spoke of homes and families left behind. Sarah found herself drawing parallels between their tales and her own journey from Ireland, all of them seeking something better, braver, truer. Sterling taught her more than just riding. She learned to read weather in cloud patterns, to spot prairie flowers among the grass, to understand the complex choreography of cattle movement. Each lesson came with stories, his father's wisdom, His mother's dreams, the legacy they'd built in this wild land. Banking and ranching aren't so different, he observed one morning as they rode the fence line. Both need attention to detail, planning for the future, trust in growth. You got a natural eye for it. Sarah felt that eye developing as she balanced the bank's books each evening. She began to see patterns in the territory's economic life, how cattle prices affected local businesses, how weather influenced lending needs, how trust and character mattered more than collateral in frontier banking. Her sister's letters from Ireland now arrived addressed to Sarah Mitchell, bank manager, a title that would have seemed impossible just months ago. She wrote back about her dual life, weekdays spent rebuilding the town's financial heart, Sundays learning the rhythms of ranch life, about Sterling, whose quiet strength had transformed her understanding of American men. One Sunday, after a particularly successful riding lesson, Sterling helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. "You're a natural," he said softly, "as if you were meant to be here." Sarah looked up at him, seeing the future in his eyes. "Perhaps I was," she replied, "just not in the way I first imagined." The moment held between them, sweet as prairie honey. Then Lady nudged Sarah's shoulder, making them both laugh, and the spell broke but didn't end, only changed shape into something warmer, more certain. Later, Sarah stood at the bank's window, watching sunset paint the town in familiar gold. Her ledgers lay neat and ordered on the desk, next to a vase of wildflowers Sterling had picked during their ride. Outside, townsfolk walked the streets with renewed purpose, greeting each other with the easy fellowship of those who'd faced darkness together and chosen light. She touched the fresh calluses on her palms, badges of her new life, earned one. Sunday at a time, the Irish girl who'd crossed an ocean seeking marriage had found something richer, independence, purpose, and a love that grew naturally as prairie grass after rain. The wanted poster arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by the same stage that brought the bank's monthly correspondence from Cheyenne. "Escaped," it proclaimed in bold letters. Marcus Kane and James Fuller fled custody during transport, armed and dangerous. Reward offered. Sarah's hands trembled as she pinned the notice to the bank's bulletin board. Out in the street, she could hear the murmur of concerned voices as word spread through town. Sterling appeared in the doorway, his expression grave. "Just got word from the marshal's office," he said, closing the door behind him. "Kane had help. Some of his old associates ambushed the prison wagon 2 days ago. 3 guards dead." Sarah sank into her chair, memories of the gallows flooding back. "He'll come here, won't he, for revenge and the records we found?" "Likely." Sterling's hand touched her shoulder briefly. "But he won't find us unprepared. Not this time." The town had changed since Kane's arrest. Deputy Wilson had been elected. Proper sheriff and a citizens' council had replaced the corrupt power structure. But old fears died hard, and Sarah saw it in people's faces as they passed the bank, the worry that Kane's shadow might once again darken their lives. That evening, a brick sailed through the bank's front window. Attached was a note. "Kane sends his regards. Sleep well, Miss Mitchell." Sterling insisted on moving Sarah to his ranch temporarily. "The house is defensible," he explained as they rode out in the gathering dusk, "and I've got men I trust watching the approaches." Mrs. Hawkins had prepared Sarah's old room, adding extra locks to the windows. "No harm will come to you here, child," the older woman promised, her voice fierce with protective instinct. But Sarah couldn't sleep. She stood at her window, watching moonlight silver the prairie grass. Somewhere out there, Kane and his men were plotting revenge against those who'd exposed their crimes. Against her. A soft knock drew her attention. Sterling stood in the doorway, still dressed, his gun belt at his hip. "Thought you might want some company," he said quietly, "and perhaps some of Mrs. Hawkins's tea." They sat in the kitchen where a lamp burned low. Sterling spoke of his ranger days, of other criminals he'd tracked, other threats faced and overcome. His voice was steady, reassuring, but Sarah heard the underlying concern. "I won't run," she said suddenly. "This is my home now. The bank, the town, the ranch. I won't let Kane take that from me." Sterling's eyes met hers across the table. Wasn't going to suggest it. You're not the running type. Proved that at the gallows. Dawn found them still talking, planning. The bank's records would be moved to a secure location. Trusted ranch. Hands would patrol the town's surroundings. Sheriff Wilson would deputize additional men. Kane's mistake, Sterling said as he walked Sarah to her room, was thinking you were alone that first time. Now you've got a whole town behind you and me. Sarah paused at her door, looking up at him. Promise me something? No heroics? Kane's already killed too many good men. His smile was gentle. Can't promise that, but I can promise to be careful, if you'll do the same. Later, watching the sun rise over Sterling Ranch, Sarah touched her mother's rosary and whispered a different kind of prayer. Not for deliverance, but for strength. Kane might be coming with hatred in his heart, but he'd find more than a frightened, mail-order bride waiting for him this time. He'd find a woman who'd faced death and chosen life, who'd built something worth fighting for. And beside her, a man who understood that some things were worth any risk to protect. The attack came at midnight, heralded by the frantic barking of ranch dogs. Sarah woke to the sound of breaking glass and Mrs. Hawkins' urgent knock at her door. "Quick, child, to the cellar!" Gunfire erupted from the darkness. Sharp cracks that shattered the night's peace. Sarah heard Sterling's voice calling orders to his men, followed by the thunder of hooves as riders circled the house. "That's far enough," Sterling's command carried across the yard. "This property's defended." A familiar voice answered from the shadows, sending chills down Sarah's spine. "James Fuller here, Sterling. Kane sends his compliments. And a message." More windows shattered as bullets struck the house. Sarah and Mrs. Hawkins crouched in the cellar, listening to the chaos above. The housekeeper clutched her rosary, so like Sarah's mother's, and whispered prayers into the darkness. The ranch hands returned fire from defensive positions Sterling had prepared. Their shots were measured, disciplined, forcing the attackers to keep their distance. Sarah recognized Sterling's training in their response. No wasted ammunition, no panic. Through gaps in the cellar's wooden ceiling, Sarah caught glimpses of movement. Sterling's men shifting positions, muzzle flashes in the darkness, shadows dancing across lamplight. The air grew thick with gun smoke and tension. A cry of pain cut through the night. One of Fuller's men hit. The attacking force's fire grew ragged, less coordinated. Then came the sound of retreating hoofbeats, Fuller's voice calling threats into the wind as they fled. When Sterling finally opened the cellar door, his face was streaked with gun smoke, but otherwise unharmed. "They're gone," he reported, helping Sarah up the stairs. "Rode east, toward the mountains. Lost one man. Left him behind." The ranch house bore the scars of battle, broken windows, bullet-pocked walls, overturned furniture, but no defenders had been seriously hurt. Sterling's preparations had paid off. Sarah helped Mrs. Hawkins tend to the minor wounds. A graze here, a splinter there. The old housekeeper's hands were steady now, her prayers replaced by practical muttering about bandages and antiseptic. Dawn revealed the full scope of the attack. Dead horses in the yard, blood trails leading east, spent cartridges glinting. In the grass, the fallen attacker lay where he'd dropped, a stranger, but his saddlebags yielded a letter that confirmed their fears. "Kane's gathering men," Sterling said, reading the blood-stained paper. "Promises of gold to anyone who helps. Him take revenge. This was just a test of our defenses." Sarah stood in the morning light, surveying the damage to her second home. "He won't stop, will he? Not until he faces justice. Real justice this time." Sterling's voice was grim. "But neither will we." Sheriff Wilson rode out from town with a posse after hearing the gunfire. They followed the attackers' trail until it disappeared into rough country, then helped secure the ranch against future raids. That evening, as workers boarded up broken windows and Mrs. Hawkins supervised repairs, Sarah found Sterling in his father's study. He stood at the window, watching the sun set behind purple mountains. "I won't ask you to leave again," he said without turning, but you should know. It's going to get worse before it gets better." Sarah moved to stand beside him, their shoulders touching. "I faced the gallows for Cain once. Facing him again, with you beside me, that's an easier choice." His hand found hers, warm and calloused. Together they watched darkness claim the land, knowing that somewhere out there, Cain was gathering his forces. But this time, Sarah wasn't a lone immigrant facing corrupt power. She was a woman who'd found her strength, her purpose, and a man who'd stand with her against any storm. The town rallied around Sterling Ranch in the days following Fuller's attack. Farmers and miners arrived with rifles and determination, ready to stand against Cain's threat. Sheriff Wilson organized them into watches, using Sterling's ranger experience to establish a defensive perimeter around both the ranch and town. Sarah split her time between the bank's iron-barred windows and the ranch's fortified walls, refusing to let fear rule her actions. Sterling matched her resolve, though his eyes followed her movements with increasing concern. One evening, as sunset painted the ranch house walls in amber light, he found her in the study, reviewing bank records. "Sarah," he said softly, "there's something we need to discuss." She looked up to find him holding a small wooden box. Inside lay his mother's wedding ring, a simple gold band worn smooth by years of love and work. "I'm not asking because of Cain," he said, meeting her eyes, "though danger has a way of clarifying what matters most. I'm asking because you're the bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever known." Sarah's heart thundered in her chest as Sterling knelt beside her chair. "When you came to Rattlesnake Junction seeking a new life, you found injustice instead. But you faced it with courage that humbled us all. You've built something precious here, in the bank, in the town, and—" He paused, voice softening. "In my heart." "Lucas," she whispered, using his given name for the first time. "Marry me, Sarah. Mitchell. Not because you need protection, but because we're stronger together. Because I love you, your spirit, your determination, everything that makes you who you are." Sarah touched the ring with trembling fingers, remembering her original journey to Wyoming as a mail-order bride. How different this felt, a choice born of love rather than necessity, offered by a man who saw her true worth. "Yes," she said simply, tears blurring her vision. 1,000 times yes. The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Sterling drew her close, his kiss tasting of promise and tomorrow. Later that evening, they shared their news with Mrs. Hawkins, who surprised them with a bottle of wine she'd been saving for a special occasion. The old housekeeper's eyes shone with happy tears as she toasted their future. But even joy couldn't completely banish the shadow of threat. As they sat on the porch watching stars emerge, a rider approached. At speed, one of Wilson's deputies with fresh intelligence. "Cain's been spotted," he reported, breathless. 20 men at least, camped in the high country. Word is, they're planning something big. Sterling's arm tightened around Sarah's shoulders. "How long?" 2 days, maybe 3. "They're gathering." More men. After the deputy left, Sarah and Sterling remained on the porch, their new engagement ring catching starlight. "We'll need to move the bank's records," she said practically. "The evidence against Cain." "Already arranged," Sterling assured her. "Wilson's men will take them to the territorial marshal's office at first light. But Sarah," he turned to face her, his expression serious. "If anything happens to me," she pressed her fingers to his lips. "Don't. We face this together, remember? Partners in everything now." His smile held equal parts pride and concern. "Partners," he agreed. "But promise me you'll be careful. Cain's hatred runs deep." Sarah touched her mother's rosary, now worn alongside her engagement ring. "I promise. But you remember too, you're not just a ranger anymore. You're my future husband, and I expect to grow old with you on this ranch." They sealed the promise with a kiss as night settled over the Wyoming territory. Somewhere in the Darkness, Kane and his men plotted revenge, but in the warmth of the ranch house, surrounded by those willing to stand against corruption, Sarah and Sterling found strength in their commitment to each other and to the future they would build together. Kane struck at dawn, when morning mist still cloaked the valley. The first warning came from a ranch hand's horn, its deep blast echoing across the property. Sarah stood at an upstairs window, counting the riders emerging from the fog. 20, maybe 30 men, with Kane and Fuller at their head. "Remember," Kane's voice carried across the yard, "Sterling and the woman are mine. The rest are yours to handle as you see fit." Sterling had prepared well for this moment. Riflemen waited in defensive positions around the ranch house and barn. Sheriff Wilson and his deputies protected the townspeople gathered in the stone church. The bank's evidence was safely away, carried to Cheyenne by the fastest riders. "Last chance, Kane," Sterling called from the front porch. "Surrender now! Face justice properly!" Kane's answer came in a hail of bullets. Sarah ducked as windows shattered around her, then hurried to her assigned position. Sterling had taught her to shoot in the days following Fuller's raid, not to make her a gunfighter, but to ensure she could defend herself if needed. The battle erupted in earnest. Gunsmoke filled the air as Kane's men charged the ranch house. Sterling's defenders held their ground, their disciplined fire taking a toll on the attackers. Sarah could hear Mrs. Hawkins below, reloading rifles and tending to the wounded. Through the chaos, Sarah spotted Fuller, trying to slip around the back of the house. Without hesitation, she fired a warning shot that sent him scrambling for cover. Sterling had been right. She wasn't just a victim anymore. Kane's voice rose again. "Burn them out! Burn it all!" Flaming arrows arced through the morning sky. Sarah rushed downstairs to help fight the small fires that caught on the roof and walls. As she passed a window, she saw Sterling locked in close combat with two of Kane's men, his ranger training evident in every move. Then came the sound they dreaded, galloping hooves approaching from the east, but instead of Kane's reinforcements, it was Tommy Jenkins leading a group of farmers and miners from the valley. They hit Kane's force from behind, throwing their attack into chaos. "Sarah!" Sterling's shout cut through the noise. "Kane's heading for the house!" She turned to see the former judge climbing onto the porch, rage twisting his features. He fired through a broken window, forcing her to dive behind an overturned table. Sterling tried to reach her, but was pinned down by Fuller's shots. "You ruined everything!" Kane raged, advancing into the house. "My town, my power, all destroyed by a foreign bride and a meddling ranger." Sarah crawled behind the staircase, hearing Kane's boots on the wooden floor. Her hands found a fallen piece of firewood, not a weapon she'd trained with, but it would have to do. As Kane rounded the stairs, Sarah swung with all her strength. The wood connected with his gun hand, sending his weapon spinning away. He lunged for her throat, but stumbled on the uneven floorboards. That moment of imbalance was all Sterling needed. He burst through the door and tackled Kane, their impact shaking the house. The two men grappled, years of hatred fueling Kane's strength, while Sterling fought with the precision of his ranger training. Sarah retrieved Kane's fallen gun just as Fuller appeared in the doorway. "Drop it," she ordered, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Fuller, seeing his leader subdued and his men surrendering outside, slowly raised his hands. When Sheriff Wilson entered minutes later, he found Kane unconscious and Fuller in custody. Outside, the morning mist had burned away, revealing the fight's aftermath. The ranch house bore new scars, but its foundations stood firm. Sterling pulled Sarah into his arms, uncaring of the soot and blood staining their clothes. "Quite a morning, future Mrs. Sterling." She smiled up at him, feeling the weight of fear finally lifting. Just another day in Wyoming territory. Around them, the sounds of battle faded into the normal rhythms of ranch life, cattle lowing in the distance, birds resuming their songs, and the steady beat of their hearts. Together. In the battle's wake, Sterling Ranch became a makeshift hospital. Mrs. Hawkins directed volunteers carrying bandages and water, while Doc Peterson tended the wounded from both sides with equal care. Sarah moved among them, offering comfort and assistance where needed. The ranch house bore proud scars: bullet holes in its walls, scorch marks from the fire arrows, broken windows that let in the afternoon breeze. But like its inhabitants, it had weathered the storm and remained standing. Sterling found Sarah on the porch, watching the territorial marshal's men escort Kane and Fuller to waiting prison wagons. This time, the transport would have a full military escort to Cheyenne. No more chances for escape. "The marshal says they'll both hang," Sterling said quietly, wrapping a gentle arm around her shoulders. "Too many dead lawmen, too many witnesses to their crimes." Sarah nodded, feeling no joy in their fate, but relief that justice would finally be served. And the others? Most were just hired guns. "They'll face prison time." He turned her to face him, examining the small cut on her forehead from flying glass. "You should let Doc Peterson look at that." She touched the wound gently. "Later. Others need him more right now." Tommy Jenkins and his father were helping repair the roof, while other townspeople cleared debris and patched bullet holes. Their work was punctuated by calls for tools and good-natured remarks about improving Sterling's decorating. Mrs. Hawkins emerged from the kitchen with coffee and sandwiches, tutting at the state of her domain, but proud of how her makeshift hospital had served. "Land's sake, but we'll need a proper celebration when this is all cleaned up. A wedding celebration, if I'm not mistaken." Sterling smiled, his thumb brushing across his mother's ring on Sarah's finger. "That we will, Mrs. Hawkins, that we will." As sunset painted the ranch in healing gold, Sarah stood with Sterling on their favorite hill. Below, people worked together to restore order, their shared effort erasing the boundaries between rancher and townfolk, merchant and farmer. "You're thinking something," Sterling observed, knowing her contemplative look, "about how things work." "Out," she replied. "I came here as a mail-order bride, seeking a simple life. Instead, I found a battle worth fighting, a community worth building, and his eyes held that special warmth reserved only for her, and a love worth waiting for." He drew her close as the first stars appeared above the mountains. Tomorrow would bring more work, rebuilding, healing, strengthening the bonds forged in adversity. But tonight they could rest in the knowledge that they had faced their trials together and emerged stronger. The Wyoming wind carried the promise of spring, of new beginnings, of a future built on truth and trust rather than fear and corruption. Sarah's mother's rosary beads clicked softly in her pocket, a reminder of how far she'd come, and how magnificently different life could be from what we first imagined. Spring bloomed across the Wyoming territory, painting the prairie with wildflowers and fresh promise. The ranch house gleamed with new paint and repairs, while in town the bank's polished windows reflected clear mountain sunlight. Sarah had moved back to her rooms above the bank during the wedding preparations, honoring tradition despite Sterling's gentle protests. Mrs. Hawkins orchestrated the preparations with military precision, transforming the ranch into a celebration of new beginnings. Women from town arrived daily with covered dishes and wedding gifts, while their menfolk raised a dance floor in the yard under Sterling's mother's favorite oak tree. Sarah's sisters had written from Ireland, sending pressed shamrocks to weave into her bouquet and their mother's lace veil, carefully preserved and shipped across an ocean. The package included a letter that brought tears to her eyes. "Mama would be so proud, not just of your marriage, but of the strong woman you've become." Sterling, for his part, found himself ambushed by townspeople eager to share marriage advice. Mr. Peterson offered wisdom about patience, while Sheriff Wilson's wife lectured him on the importance of remembering anniversaries. He accepted it, all with good grace, his eyes tracking Sarah whenever she was near. "Never thought I'd see the day," Mrs. Hawkins remarked, catching him watching Sarah direct the placement of flowers. The confirmed bachelor ranger, moon-eyed as any young buck. The bank's new assistant manager, a capable young woman Sarah had trained herself insisted on handling all business during the week before the wedding. "You've given this town so much," she said firmly. "Let us give you this time." Reverend Whitaker held the rehearsal in the newly expanded church, its walls still fragrant with fresh-cut pine. The simple ceremony would blend Sarah's Irish Catholic traditions with frontier Protestant practicality, a bridge between old world and new, just as their union bridged past and future. The evening before the wedding, Sarah stood in her bank, Office 1, last time as Miss Mitchell. Her mother's rosary lay beside Sterling's ring on the desk, symbols of the path that had led her here. She wrote in her ledger a final entry, "Balance paid in full, with interest in joy." A knock at the door revealed Sterling, breaking tradition to steal a moment alone. "Ready for tomorrow?" he asked, drawing her close. "More than ready," she replied, breathing in his familiar scent of leather and sage. "Though Mrs. Hawkins will scold you for seeing me tonight. Worth the risk." He kissed her softly. "Sleep well, future Mrs. Sterling." That night, Sarah dreamed not of Ireland's green fields, nor of Cain's dark threats, but of tomorrow's promise, of a life built on love and trust, of children running through prairie grass, of growing old together on land they defended and cherished. Dawn would bring her wedding day, but she was already home. 1 year later, autumn sunlight streamed through the ranch house windows as Sarah balanced the bank's ledgers at her father-in-law's old desk. Sterling's latest letter from his circuit. Rounds lay beside her work, his words warming her heart. 2 more days, then home to you. The town had flourished in the past year. The railroad had finally arrived, bringing new settlers and opportunities. Sarah managed both the bank and ranch accounts now, while Sterling split his time between ranching and serving as a territorial lawman, building the justice system he'd always envisioned. Mrs. Hawkins hummed in the kitchen, watching Sarah's growing belly with grandmotherly pride. "Another Sterling to help run this ranch," she'd say, patting her apron contentedly. "Your mama would be so proud." Sarah touched the rosary beads that still lay beside her inkwell, then the wedding ring that hadn't left her finger since that joyful spring day. Outside, ranch hands rode past the window, tipping their hats to Mrs. Sterling with easy respect. She hadn't come to Wyoming seeking this life, hadn't imagined herself as a banker, rancher's wife, and soon-to-be mother. But God's plans, her mother always said, were bigger than our own. Sometimes the longest road home was the one you never meant to take. Standing at the window, Sarah watched sunset paint the mountains gold and smiled, knowing Sterling was riding toward her under that same golden sky.